So is the Blackrock Bitcoin ETF really going to be bullish for Bitcoin? Let's go ahead and discuss this. So welcome back to Upside Down Data. I want to talk a little bit about this news that broke recently about BlackRock filing for a Bitcoin spot ETF and how likely this might be to happen and what it might mean for Bitcoin if this does go through. So not going to get into super deep details about it, but there are a couple of things about this application that make people I think it's more reasonable to expect it might actually get approved than the other ones, which have just been shot down by the SEC over and over. So one of the things is just the way that the ETF is structured, that they're actually going to be including this surveillance sharing agreement as part of it. And this is really aimed at targeting concerns the SEC has always raised about market manipulation being the reason why they've shot down prior ETFs, is really targeted at trying to reduce those concerns. Now, I think it's an open argument or open question in terms of whether or not the SEC really is worried about that, or if they're just using it as an excuse to just not approve any Bitcoin spot ETFs. But at least there's some things in the structure of this proposal that are different than prior ones that at least seem to be trying to target those specific concerns. We'll just have to see if that's actually what the SEC cared about or if it was more of just a cover. But the other thing that people have been pointing out is that BlackRock is maybe a little bit harder to turn down than some other firms who are trying to launch ETFs. So BlackRock, if you're not familiar, they are the largest asset manager in the world, $10 trillion of assets under management. They are massive. They have a lot of influence. They hold a lot of sway. And one of the other things that people have been talking about is that Larry Fink, their CEO, one of the founders of BlackRock, is a Democrat. He has a lot of influence, a lot of connections within the Democratic Party. And so currently it's been the Democrats who've been putting up a lot of the roadblocks for crypto. So if, Fink signed off on going after this ETF, then maybe there's also some strings that are going to be pulled in the background to try to make the acceptance or the approval of it more likely. Now, that's all just wild speculation. Who knows if that's what they're doing, or who knows what really even is the motivation. Some people have speculated that BlackRock is just doing this for a political statement. They don't actually expect it to get approved. I'll let you make up your own decision about what you think their underlying motives are. But I did just want to bring this up, that beyond just the application itself and some things that they changed, there also are some things that might also make you think that it's a little bit harder to turn down a ETF proposal from BlackRock than some of the other firms. But ultimately, a lot of that has to do with speculation. So now let's move on and just say, okay, let's imagine that the ETF did get approved. So let's just imagine that happened. It's far from certain, obviously, that will happen, but let's just imagine that happened. What would that mean for Bitcoin's price? So one of the things that I saw recently go out there, so this is something that Will Clemente tweeted out and some others have talked about this also, was that when you look at gold as maybe being a bit of an analogy, that when the first ETF for gold launched, GLD, then gold went on this massive run, from the beginning that Will's pointing out here all the way through here. Now, the one thing that I wanted to point out about this claim about how, the first ETF being launched and then suddenly gold went to the moon, that means that Bitcoin will do this too. That's basically the point that Will was making in his tweet here. But the point I really wanted to bring up here is that correlation does not equal causation. So just because when GLD launched, Bitcoin went to this big run, doesn't mean it wouldn't have done that anyway without GLD being there. You'll note that going into when GLD was launched, Bitcoin was already in the beginnings of a bull market. Precious metals were entering a bull market through this period. And so sure, it continued to go up after GLD released, but you can't say with any certainty that this is because of GLD or that GLD caused price to move up to this same degree. You don't know. It could have been the price would have done the same thing without it. We don't have a control condition. We don't have anything to compare it to. We can't test an alternate history where GLD didn't launch and it was just the spot gold price the whole way, no ETFs being involved. And so with that being said, then, I just wanted to put maybe a bit of cold water on that idea that things have to go to the moon just because the ETF releases. We can also look at silver, the same thing. When the first silver ETF released back here in 2006, silver did move up, but it's a little bit less of an impressive move, especially at the beginning. It kind of chopped sideways for a while before then putting in its top and then kind of cooling off back down. And so certainly just looking at this, it's not universally the case that when you launch an ETF for something like gold or some commodity or, like Bitcoin, that the price is just going to immediately go off to the moon. We have no idea. And I think what's probably the case is there might have been I think somewhere in the middle is probably the most likely, although again, this is just speculation. But that I suspect that GLD there certainly helped add more liquidity into it, kind of add more fuel to the fire to help drive gold's price up higher. But gold was probably already going to be moving up higher anyway with or without it. And so in some ways, the timing was just lucky that as gold entered into this secular bull market, GLD entered in, relatively early and then rode a lot of that up. And so then when we're talking about Bitcoin, then maybe one of the things that we want to think about here is the timing of that ETF launch. If an ETF launches at the market cycle high, so let's imagine that Bitcoin just already went through a full bull market, and then a spot Bitcoin ETF launches right at that point, I don't think it's really necessarily all that guaranteed that that's just immediately going to send Bitcoin up even higher. In fact, what it could end up doing is just adding more exit liquidity, and people just dump out and it marks the top. And it sort of happened over here with the futures ETFs. When those launched, that actually ended up marking the top over here for the second top in late 2021. But alternatively, if we were to get that ETF like right now, for example, and let's imagine that Bitcoin is re-entering a new bull market, let's imagine that this holds as being the bear market low, then it very well could be something that adds fuel to the fire to whatever that next bull run is, and you could go up. But I did just want to kind of give that perspective because there's been some kind of mega bull posting and using things like comparing gold and GLD to this and saying that, oh, it just means you can expect that kind of price action if that happens. I think that's premature, and we want to be a little bit careful. I'd be a little bit careful in making extreme statements like that because, again, that is not something we can look at. We can know for sure looking at this. Again, correlation does not equal causation. But that's not to say that I don't think that this is bullish. I actually think this is bullish for a number of reasons. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about was that if we just look at the current risk profile for Bitcoin, or kind of where it sits. So this is our long-term upside downside potential indicator. So it's our risk model. Basically, as you get to higher values, that means higher risk. So up 5 being the max, and then -5 being the minimum. And so when you get up to these points where you're up close to 5, above 4, close to 5, that's situations where the remaining upside potential is quite low. And then relative to that, the downside potential is quite high. And so that's why you see these really high values at market cycle tops, because the remaining upside is quite minimal, and then the remaining downside is quite large. And then vice versa, down at these low points, that's when the downside is relatively low, especially when compared to the amount of upside that's there. The downside low, upside is quite high, or potential upside is quite high. And where we sit right now for Bitcoin is quite low. So this is the long-term BDPI. So it's reactive to moves that play out over months to multiple months. It's much more macro in its focus. So what it's basically saying is that kind of on that longer-term focus, there's quite a bit of realistic upside that Bitcoin could eat up. And the thing is that it just needs something to push it to actually do that. It needs something to create this impulse, like we see in previous bull markets, to really have it go up and eat up that realistic upside potential. And so that's where something like this ETF could do it. And it's not necessarily just the ETF on its own, launching, but also just the mere narrative of it. If a Bitcoin ETF gets approved, there's going to be that whole narrative, that speculative rush to try to front run all of that money that's going to be, assumed to be coming in from the ETF, which then could really start catapulting price up. And then ultimately what fuels these big runs that we see, these big bull markets, is that kind of FOMO, where you get some initial spark or initial dynamics that creates price starting in this aggressive up move. And then you get a lot of people coming in, and people who haven't been following crypto, people who just hear about it and say, oh, crypto's going crazy, better hop in, don't want to miss out. And that just adds more and more fuel to the fire until you ultimately get to these points where you've realized all of that realistic upside potential, or the vast majority of it, and then the downside is what remains. And so that's where I think the timing of this ETF could matter. I think if this were to drop soon, or while we're in kind of still this if not continued bear market, this kind of transition out of a bear market into an early bull market, that could add that early fuel to the fire that really could kick off one of these broader moves. But if we wait, and if we're already doing something like this, I don't think that that's going to make, create a second bull market that just doubles the returns beyond what we just saw in the original bull market. So I think timing might matter a little bit in what's been going on in the market. In some ways, what is the realistic upside potential at that point might kind of dictate what we might expect to come from this. Do we expect this to be more of a GLD type situation, or something that might be a little bit more like an SLV situation, although maybe not even necessarily getting this top, depending on when in the cycle it would be released. But even if the BlackRock application gets denied, I still think that this is bullish for Bitcoin and crypto more generally. And the reason for that is it's a vote of confidence in the space at a time when there's been almost nothing but bad news. You know, you're getting the SEC coming with all this regulation. We're still dealing with the fallout from the FTX collapse. Crypto has a very bad name. People don't think very positively of it, at least people outside of the space. Now, I know that the Bitcoin maxis are going to say, oh, Bitcoin's not crypto. You can't lump them together. Come on, people outside of crypto do not make any distinction. People outside of crypto see Bitcoin and the rest of crypto as being one thing. So seeing BlackRock being the largest asset manager out there applying to try to get into having a Bitcoin ETF is a vote of confidence in the space. And the more that we might see this kind of thing from big players, the more it might help to start kind of repair the reputation a bit of crypto. And then as time goes on and memories fade, as it always does, that could then set that stage, set the groundwork for what could lead into a next bull market. Because really, right now, for example, in 2018, everyone thought crypto was dead. It was worthless to try to invest there. No one really cared. But then as we went further and further along in time, suddenly by the time we got into 2020, 2021, now crypto was the darling again. Everyone was talking about it. Everyone was obsessed with it. And the same kind of dynamics, are likely to repeat again. We're down here at the depths. Crypto's dead. We'd be a fool to be looking at it. But then as time goes on from there, it is probably going to be that memories fade and then new narratives take over and suddenly people are willing to get back in. The same kind of thing happened back through here, exact types of dynamics, pretty much every single bear market that we have seen. And so, whether or not the ETF is approved or not, I still think it's useful from that perspective, and that can help to start kind of repair some of those wounds. And also just frankly, it shows that big institutions have not just completely abandoned the space. And it would not surprise me if going forward, more start laying groundwork of their own to try to capitalize whenever the next bull market might come around. Now that's obviously speculation, but it does, this is at least a first step in that direction. And that, in my opinion, is a good sign. Also, if you want to get access to metrics like the upside downside potential indicator, not just for Bitcoin, but for a bunch of other assets that we have, go on over to our website, polaritydigital.io. Polarity Digital Pro subscribers are able to access all of these data live. So if you're interested, we're currently offering that subscription for $15 a month. And if you lock in at that rate, it will stay that way forever unless you were to unsubscribe. We think that's an absolute bargain. It's not going to stay there for terribly long, and we're going to bump it up soon. We're going to let you know when that happens. We'll probably leave it there for a few more weeks, at least another week or two before we do that. We'll announce when we're ready to move it up. But if you want to lock in that low rate, you can go ahead and go over to polaritydigital.io and do that now.